Well, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to be here. We are in the actual physical space of the Mershon Center here now in our new location in Derby Hall. This is our first event with an in-person component since March the 6th, 2020. Not that I'm counting, but we are very excited to be back here in person and to have such a wonderful event for the discussion today. I want to give a big thank you to Kelly Whitaker, who has been making some of the technology work here, as well as Kyle McRae. The two of them have made this happen. Oh, if we do have any technical difficulties, I'll ask you to indulge us as we figure out this new hybrid format. But we're excited to be back in person, but also continuing to be present to everyone on the internet, so you can continue to access the Mershon Center that way as well. So we have a very timely speaker today, and with that, I will turn the floor over to Rick Herman, our host for this event, and who's put this together. And Rick can introduce our speaker.
Thank you. I'm Rick Herman. I co-direct for the last several years a research group here at the Mershon Center that focuses on American foreign and military policy, along with Pete and Stuart. And in the past year or so, we decided we would focus this year on Russia. That was about 2.5 years ago, actually. Russia's relationship with NATO and with the West. And last fall, I thought, I know the perfect person to come and help us understand more about Russia. Our former colleague, Tim Frye, who's written a wonderful new book last year called Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. So I asked Tim last fall, and we put a mark on the calendar for today on March 24th. And a lot has changed in the world since then to make this conference even more relevant. Tim is the Marshall D. Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia University. He's previously been director of the Harriman Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Columbia. He's been chair of the Department of Political Science at Columbia. And most importantly at all, he began his career here as our colleague at Ohio State University. And it's just wonderful to have you back in Columbus, Tim. Thank you for coming in person and joining us again at Ohio State. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the table over to you to talk about your...
Thanks a lot. It's great to be back. I wish I was back under better circumstances where I wasn't getting texts from my Ukrainian colleagues just to make sure that they're still alive, or from my Russian colleagues trying to figure out whether or not they fled the country. So it's a difficult time, but I think it's really important to have these kinds of discussions. So and the book, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the book. Just as a way to give us a lens for talking about current events. So I'll take about 10, 12 minutes, talk about what I tried to do in the book, and then try to figure out what from the book is useful for understanding current events in Russia and Ukraine. So the simplest way to describe Weak Strongman is that it's an explainer book. It tries to translate some of the best social science we have on Russia over the last 20 years on all the important questions. Is Putin popular? Do elections matter? How does repression work? Can cyber warriors swing foreign elections? And the book should have something for everybody, whether you're an expert on Russia or whether you're just Russia curious. So there's no shortage of books on Russia. In designing the book, we went with a white cover. We put Putin in the background to try to separate the book out from the pile of books with the dark picture of the Kremlin and Putin in some very kind of ominous pose. And so that was a conscious decision, because I think the book really does depart from a lot of books about Russia. And I'll talk about 3 ways. First, it departs from most popular books on Russia in that it critiques 2 of the most common narratives about Russia, what I'll call Putinology and what I'll call the exceptional Russia view. So I'll illustrate with the case of the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who at the time was the richest man in Russia and the owner of Yukos, a very prominent Russian oil company. And one view says this happened in 2003 because Putin, this ex-KGB man, came to power and he wanted to reward his cronies and consolidate his power, and Khodorkovsky had been a threat. So this really kind of reduces this key issue in Russian politics to kind of Putin's worldview and background. Another view says, no, it's not really about Putin, it's really about Russian history, which is another frequent lens through which people see Russian politics. And this emphasizes the historic fusion of state and private property and the supposed notion that Russians are ill-disposed towards markets and democracy. So the problem with these two views is that similar expropriations of oil companies took place around the same time in Algeria, Bolivia, Chad, Dubai, Ecuador, Senegal, and Venezuela. So it's, these leaders didn't have KGB backgrounds. They didn't have, hundreds of years of serfdom and marginality on the Eurasian continent. And another study showed that in autocracies between 1960 and 2006, when oil prices go up, nationalizations are a lot more likely. So what the book tries to do is to situate Russia in the family of autocracies and to put Russia in comparative perspective in a way that doesn't really happen very much in popular books on Russia. So rather than arguing that Putin is a unique leader overseeing a unique country, I argue we should focus on the type of government Russia has. So view Russia as a personalist autocracy that differs from other kinds of autocracies like one-party regimes like we see in Vietnam or China, the Soviet Union, and military regimes like we'd see in Myanmar or Chile. And these leaders in these personalist autocracies, as we see in Turkey, we saw in Venezuela, as we're seeing in Hungary as well, they rule by a mixture of personal popularity, good performance, and repression as needed, and propaganda, but they vary these tools. And the tricky part for these personalist autocrats is that they recognize that repression is a very costly instrument, and they try to rule by other means whenever possible. But that's hard. It's hard to do in part because they face two threats that are difficult to resolve at the same time. They can be overthrown by their inner circle, or they could be overthrown by a mass revolt. And typically addressing one of these threats makes the other threat worse, right? So if you think about the economy, Putin, like many autocrats, allows his inner circle to get fantastically rich, but he can't allow the corruption to be so bad that the economy tanks and people take to the streets. Right? So similarly, if we think about elections, personalist autocrats, they cheat on elections enough so that they can be confident they're going to win, but they can't cheat so much that they signal their ultimate weakness. They need to keep the security services strong, but not so strong that they overthrow them. They need to repress political opponents, but not so much that there's a backlash against them. They manipulate the news, but not so much that people turn off the television. They use anti-Westernism to rile the base, but they try to avoid provoking a war most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Moreover, leaders in personalist autocracies have different patterns than we see in one-party autocracies and military autocracies. So growth tends to be slower, repression tends to be higher, corruption tends to be higher in these personalist autocracies. And that's a lot of what we see in Russia. So rather than treating Putin as a kind of all-powerful dictator who can just issue orders and things just happen, it recognizes that Putin faces a host of really difficult trade-offs. And to understand Russian politics, we need to understand the shifts in power among and between the elites and the masses and the rulers. So it's not really a Putin book. Like I had a lot of people say, oh, this is a Putin book, right? But it's not. The whole point of the book is that we need to look beyond Putin to take into account Russian society and Russian elites as well. So that's one way in which it's different. Another way it's different is that there's lots of great reporting on Russia. Someday, David Remnick will step down from editing The New Yorker, and everybody who studies Russia will shed a tear because we had this great reporting, long-form journalism in The New Yorker, and lots of other publications, arguably better than for most countries. If we think about the reporting on Ukraine, I think it's been incredible this last month. However, what this book does is something very different. It takes academic research and tries to translate it for a general audience. Unfortunately, the research on Russia over the last 20 years has been terrific. Russia, for all of its problems, has been a great place to study autocracy relative to Iran, Iraq, Sudan, China, lots of other places where it's really hard to do research. Russia, until the war, you could do reliable public opinion research. There was lots of good administrative data, partly a legacy of the Soviet system where they like to count things. We like that as academics. You have lots of smart Russians, so that's a well-educated country, so lots of local human capital. And you have a whole generation of smart young Russians, many of whom have been trained in the West, who are doing phenomenal research. So in the book, you'll learn how my colleagues and I do surveys to try to figure out whether or not people are lying when they answer questions about Putin's popularity, how we scrape the web to identify ties between political and economic elites in Russia, how we use Twitter to track propaganda campaigns. I cite one of my colleagues who tracked graffiti in Moscow, in different parts of Moscow, and looked at the themes of them and saw how the Kremlin was able to push the more controversial forms of graffiti from the center of Moscow out to the periphery. You'll learn about how my colleagues gather archival data to track how Stalin's purges influenced voting patterns in the 1990s and the 2000s. And if you look at journals, academic journals, people are publishing articles on Russia at a higher rate in better quality journals than any time in my 40 years now of studying Russia. So it's been a long time. Now, unfortunately, this work has had zero impact on the outside world, on our great national debate about Russia. It's had a little bit of an impact on policymakers, but very small. So a second goal is really to bring this research out to a general audience. And the third thing, and what has been the most fun thing about the book, I think, is I'm able to mix in a lot of my personal anecdotes of my adventures and misadventures in Russia over the last 30 years, from being the accidental target of a honey trap by the KGB in the late 1980s to witnessing the fall of the Twin Towers from Moscow, which gave me a really different perspective on the event, to running a research center at the Higher School of Economics over the last decade. And I think that this makes the book a much better read. You want people to keep turning pages, and these anecdotes, I think, help that. But they also provide insights into Russia that I think are hard to come by unless you've spent a lot of time there. So I think the books have a kind of stylistic component to them, but they also have an evidentiary component that allowed me to see things that I wouldn't have normally seen if I was just looking at quantitative data. So in writing up the book, I've learned the definition of eternity. So the definition of eternity is from early December when I hit send on the final version of December 2020. Is that right? No, yes, December 2020. Yes, it came out in April 2021. So at this point, Navalny is still in hospital in Germany. So there's a lot that's happened over the last year. And so is this book completely outdated? Shockingly, I would argue no. And I think it really does help understand a couple of important trends in Russia. One of them being, the decision to invade Ukraine, although it's obviously not a complete, a complete account by any stretch. But the foreign policy chapter here was the most difficult one to write because Russia is an unusual autocracy in foreign policy for reasons that are pretty apparent: nuclear weapons, membership on the UN Security Council, its sheer vastness, stretching across 11 time zones, and its historical role as a global power. So I don't cite a lot of the really good research on comparative autocracy foreign policy, just because Russia is pretty anomalous. Also, in this book, I really critique Russian politics to Putin's background and his personality. But in foreign policy, leaders matter more. And in crises, their personality and their worldviews matter a lot more. So this is kind of a hard test for my argument. But I think in three ways it's helpful. One is, a key point in the book is that Putin has changed his narrative and tools for governing Russia over time. So in the first decade in office, the size of the Russian economy doubles. Living standards soar, poverty falls. Putin's very popular, partly to his own credit in that he managed this huge inflow of oil money well. But as one colleague noted, we have Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Vladimir the Lucky, because he comes into power right when oil prices are really low, and then shortly thereafter, they zoom up. Then in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, he has a new narrative for governing Russia. Russia's back as a global player, and that lasts for about 4 years, and then the Crimean consensus really wears off. And around 2018 or so, growth has been flat for almost a decade. Propaganda isn't working as well as people mistrust state media more and turn to social media at a higher rate. There's a lot of Putin fatigue going on where, he's been in power a long time by this point and people are ready for a change. Foreign policy successes are really hard to come by. Crimea was great. It was low risk. The West was not going to get involved. It was high reward. And those opportunities don't come along very often. So around 2018, we see repression at home becoming much stricter than it had been at any point in Putin's prior time. And we see him increasingly reliant on the security services in order to manage domestic politics. And they increasingly use repression at home, in part because these other tools just are no longer available. And this is also the group that has the most hawkish, most anti-American views on foreign policy. So, if we're looking at kind of state capture story and who has access to Putin, I think that, the view that I have of, looking at these trade-offs that autocrats make, I think it helps to, give us some insight into, how the decision to invade Ukraine was made. I also think that the invasion has turned out to be an incredible mistake. And it's the classic pathology of personalist autocracies of the difficulty of getting accurate information. And, we've already seen that we're in the 30th day of Putin's 3-day war. And the expectation that the Ukrainian government was going to fold, that the Ukrainian army was a paper tiger, and that they would drop their weapons and run away hasn't been borne out. You underestimated the Western reaction, particularly the Germans. I also think there was greater belief. Well, actually, I'll leave it at that. And that this kind of institutional pathology leading to informational biases is a classic feature of personalist regime. But it goes even further because in the last 3 years, the kind of small but feisty section of independent media in Russia, which provided a lot of valuable information, including for people in government, has been snuffed out, right? So, if we think that mistakes are likely to be made, and I should say that this is, war optimism is not unique to personalist autocracies. We can look at shock and awe, 2003, a very different political system, but leaders are prone to talk themselves into wars that look easy, but turn out to be much more difficult. But I think that pathology is even stronger in the Russian case. And then we've already seen the house arrest of 2 key figures in the FSB who were responsible for reporting on the political situation in Ukraine. Well, at least they're not being seen in public. There are rumors that are under house arrest. We don't really know. but that's where attention has been turned. Tells us something that Putin might have realized at this point, that the information he got about the prospects for going into Ukraine were much less than he thought. The other problem is that the weak institutions of personalist autocracies make it easy for a single individual to take power, but that also means that leader has few of the kinds of formal institutionalized constraints that Putin even had, 4, 5, 6 years ago, when he was meeting more regularly with a more diverse set of leaders. And we do see that in the comparative literature, there's some evidence that personalist autocrats are more likely to go to war. And there's some evidence that they tend to fight those wars less well, perhaps because they choose them badly, or because the troops are not all that excited about fighting for what is typically a really corrupt elite, which also might shed some light on the, let's say, less than optimal level of morale that the Russian soldiers are showing on the ground. But of course, that's not the whole story here. A key idea here is that Putin matters in this case in a way that I don't think he's mattered for lots of policies. In that, to my mind, Putin sees himself as rectifying what he sees as a historic injustice, that Ukraine has been torn away from its natural body of Russia, and that through his actions, that might be costly in the short run, but over time, people will come to see the wisdom that this historic wrong will have been righted, and that he will be the gatherer of the lands in Russian parlance, and that this will be a triumph, even if at the moment things have not gone very well. And why does Putin matter? Is because this is a view that's not widely held by many in the Russian political elite, and it's certainly not a view that's held by many Russians. If you look at public opinion polling, if you ask Russians what kind of relations they would like to have with Ukraine, 80% say they would like to have friendly relations with Ukraine as a sovereign state, and less than 20% say that they would like to see a unification with Ukraine. And that's a question that's been asked since 2008, every couple of years, and there's been almost no change on it. Also, Russian public opinion is keenly sensitive to casualties. If you look at public support for the intervention in Syria, it was never very high. It never reached 50%, and it quickly fell to around 30%. If you look at public opinion around introducing Russian troops into eastern Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea, when fighting was hot, only 30% of Russians supported that, even at the time when fighting was the most hot. So, and this is one of the reasons why I think the Russian government was so keen on denying any role in eastern Ukraine, and why the journalists who reported on casualties of Russian soldiers fighting in eastern Ukraine often found themselves beaten up or out of a job. So the Kremlin seems to understand this, and this might be one of the reasons why a lightning strike on Kiev was a much more attractive perspective than a longer war that might have been more costly. Okay. So what do we? I think this approach also, helps us understand looking forward, in that I think we're likely to see splits within the Russian elite between the very hawkish national security types who've been very much behind this war, versus the economic oligarchs or business people, whatever we want to call them, who have suffered tremendously and have benefited incredibly from openness to the outside world. I think within Russian society, you're going to see a massive schism between those who favor fortress Russia, of an isolated Russia, a inward-looking Russia, mostly older people dependent on the state for their living, more nationalists, and the sector of Russia that wants a global Russia that's benefited incredibly from economic openness, that likes Instagram, that likes Facebook, that likes McDonald's, and wants to integrate with the rest of the world. And Russia has never been through this. They've never had the full accounting for its role in the international affair, because during the Soviet period, there was no debate about World War II. There was no debate about Eastern Europe. There was no debate about Afghanistan. It's all, I compare it to the US case in the 60s over Vietnam, where for the first time, huge swaths of the US population began to think, man, maybe we're not the good guys after all. And from my Russian colleagues, the same kinds of kitchen counter conversations of the parents trying to say, oh, but those fascists in Ukraine, we have to root them out, and their sons and daughters saying, Mom, what are you talking about? There are no fascists. Well, at least not at high levels of the Ukrainian government. Let's put it that way. Or at least the picture that you're getting is not exactly accurate. Let's put it that way. So over the last 40 years, I've seen many of my Russian colleagues try to build a better Russia, a Russia that's less corrupt, that's more tolerant, that's more respectful of individual rights, that's more open to the outside world. And that hope has been shattered. I mean, just shattered. And if Russian history tells us anything, this isn't the end of the story. There will be a lot more game to be played. Also, I think it's important to remember that Putin had many ways to bring Russia back to global prominence. Right? He could have used Russia's really tremendous historical and cultural heritage to create a new brand for Russia. He could have used Russia's high level of education to create Russia as a center for international scholarship and commitment to high-tech economy. He could have used the great natural resource wealth of Russia to try to diversify the economy in a way that would have brought less inequality and a broader base growth. He could have used his great popularity to reduce corruption. Instead, he's brought Russia back to prominence for the moment in the most costly way possible: aggression abroad and repression at home. And Weak Strongman tells that story. So thanks.
We have a lot of people online, but let's start in the room. Are there questions? Marcus?
Yeah, I have a question. In thinking about this, we hear even your presentation, and you're the least Putin-ness of the bunch. It seems we hear about Putin, and then a couple of potential opponents out in either in the sort of the state, in the security apparatus, or the oligarchs. Who is Putin? In other words, what is his actual base?
Oh,
Second, is the military the same thing as the security services? And what's the relationship there? And third, what on earth can the oligarchs do?
Great.
To repeat the question a little bit.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So the question revolves around who is Putin and who is his base. Is there a distinction? What kind of distinction should we be drawing between the security services and the military and the National Guard and all of these other different organizations that Putin has helped to put into place? Was there one more?
And the third is the oligarchs.
The oligarchs. Yes, yes. Great. So the first question is what's interesting is Putin's base has changed dramatically. So in his first decade in office, the economic winners backed Putin, the rising middle class, who was benefiting from the oil growth and the incredible economic opportunities that Russians had never seen growth on this scale. I don't want to say ever, but it could be ever. I mean, in that short a period of time to have the size of the GDP double, and they were happy with Putin for that. After 2011, when this group decided they also wanted more political rights and less corruption and took to the streets to protest against election fraud, it was a pivotal moment, because that is when Putin said, I'm going to shift my base and I'm going to rely on older people, people dependent on the state for the economy, nationalists, not the crazy nationalists, but the kind of patriotic core of of Russian society, the rural population rather than the big cities, and that's a big part of Russian society. So as we show in the book, Putin after Crimea was legitimately popular. It wasn't just a fluke of people being afraid to tell survey poll takers that they weren't lying when they answered this question. But his popularity has fallen a lot, particularly among younger folks under 40. A majority do not support Putin. 40 to 55, it's more mixed. And then there's majority support among people over 55. But if you're thinking of a forward rising Russia, the human capital, it's an outflow, not an inflow. Physical capital, it's an outflow, not an inflow. The groups supporting Putin are getting older, not younger. So this is not a story of a rising power. So among the what some people call the collective Putin, which is Putin and the head of the National Security Council, which is this 12-member body, which over time has just displaced every other decision-making body. And it has the 5 or 6 really key members who are the head of the National Security Council, the head of the security services, the FSB, the head of the National Guard, which is directly underneath Putin, and the military. So those are the guys with guns. And there's rivalry among them for budgets and all kinds of things. On the other hand, their leaders, they're all almost of the same age. They all have very hawkish anti-American views. None of those other people have a group out in society that they could rely on. And they're all very tightly tied to this decision to go into Ukraine. So the way that there could be some maneuvering going on is, clearly the security services who were supposed to tell Putin what was going on the ground in Ukraine underperformed. The military itself has underperformed as well. So if you're sitting in one of those seats and being the fall guy in an autocracy is not a good place to be. Putin himself is the one who made the decision. So, one could imagine people looking around the room and saying, I'm not going to get blamed for this. I'm going to try to push the blame onto somebody else. So, we have no idea what's going on. The defense minister just disappeared for 12 days and reappeared on a Zoom call today, which I don't know if that makes me feel better or no, but there's a lot going on that we just don't know. But the military was one of the most trusted organizations in Russian society in recent years. After Crimea, after Syria, after this massive propaganda campaign to build it back up as an organization, it is some measures the most trusted organizations. The security services less so. And then the oligarchs they're pretty much on the outside looking in, particularly the ones who ingratiate themselves with the West. They are very marginalized. But Putin also needs people to run factories, right? He needs people to make sure the economy runs. And, some of them are capable managers. And if you want to replace them with, a complete loyalist who can't get the job done, that could be a problem. Particularly, managing a factory in Russia just got a lot harder. This last month, I think one risk that Putin faces is that the country just becomes ungovernable. If factories start to seize up, they're shoveling money at the currency to try to keep it afloat. The economic elites who are who suffered tremendous losses. If there's a hint of domestic instability at home, I think that's as much a constraint on Putin's behavior in Ukraine as what happens on the ground in Ukraine.
Alex?
Okay, that was a really interesting talk. I have sort of a small question and then a somewhat bigger one. My small one is Sergei Lavrov. I can't figure this guy out. So would you include him in that category of the sort of national security hardliners? Because you know, he's able to obviously travel around the world and act like a normal diplomat. But then, you know, he must also be in some of these meetings, and I can't figure out what he's thinking. And then, so the first question is about Lavrov. The second question is the relationship with China. And I can't figure this out either. Like, do you think Putin sees China as sort of a natural ally and friend, or is it just that they're kind of united by being anti-West? And do you think that Putin kind of overestimated the extent to which China would back the invasion, the special military operation in Ukraine?
That's right. That's right. 15 years for you, calling it a war, not a special military operation. I've been on Zoom calls with Russian colleagues where they make it clear that that's what they're talking about, and everybody understands why. So, so Lavrov, most people think he's pretty much on the outside, that he is just a face for the Kremlin, and he's very good at playing the anti-Western card. People know him. He has lots of contacts. But there have been a number of points over the last few months where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been really behind the 8 ball, where they have not, it's been news to them when reporters are asking them questions about decisions that are being made. Or so he is part of the Security Council, so he is, one of the 12 members of this important body, but he doesn't have the same kind of institutional power that the security agencies guys, or the personal relationship that some of these guys have with Putin, who've been with him for a long time. And on China, it's a so China abstained from the vote to condemn, which was expected. The way I understand the situation is domestically in China, the government is 100% behind Russia. Outside of China, it's a much more mixed picture. And, Ukraine's largest trading partner is China. People don't recognize, not that, Russia's a much bigger trading partner, obviously, but there are real risks for China if the war goes badly in Ukraine. And they're seen as being overly sympathetic to Russia. Also, Chinese corporates, they want to abide by the sanctions because they have a lot more skin in US trade than with trade with Russia. So historically, even in 2014, 2015, Chinese corporates went along with the sanctions because if you, do trades with a sanctioned entity, then you become subject to sanctions yourself. And they're very aware of that. China might be able to play a role of a broker here. If anything, that would be something that Putin would listen to. There have been talks that, maybe Ukraine would be willing to, think about China as a potential, go-between. The Israelis seems to have failed. The Turks have offered their services, but that hasn't worked out. So that's one possibility. But the other thing is that, China really took advantage of Russia after the Crimean annexation, where Chinese companies became the monopoly supplier of credit. And they said, oh, this is a great, we're glad to help you out. But by the way, this is what the margin is going to be on these loans we're going to give you. And China is not going to do things, and this is, people who know this question better than I do, who studied the sanctions. I was on a panel yesterday, and one of the lines was, China's not going to do anything that's going to hurt China. That's for sure. So, they're not going to go out of their way to really help. And Dmitry Trenin, a really great Russian foreign policy advisor, says that the Russia-China relationship boils down to they are not always together, but they're never against each other. So that's the limits. So.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about, it was written before this crisis, of course. Yeah. You talk about the prospects for the Russian economy over the next decade. Yeah. I think your word is dim. My question would be that suppose the war ends in, say, the next month, the troops are withdrawn, there's a certain amount of relaxation of tensions. of sanctions. But obviously wariness and hostility to Russia would be very high, certainly in Europe. Would you reevaluate the DIM? And do you see collapse as a possibility or?
Well, collapse is not likely unless the sanctions really bite and they're on for a long time. But in your scenario, you know, the political incentives to avoid collapse are very strong.
Yeah.
And that's what Putin has done very well, is they've muddled through this last decade of slower flat growth. And slower flat growth is annoying, but it's hard to mobilize around flat growth or 1% growth, or, you know, we're falling behind the rest of the world a little bit each year. You know, that, yeah. But, you know, the reputational costs to going back into Russia are going to last for a while. You know, the energy companies certainly will be there. You know, maybe some of the big manufacturing companies with global, you know, operations. But it's a really tough place to do business under the best of circumstances. You know, the rule of law is weak. Any company of a certain size, you know, has to be able to make agreements with the powers that be, often through sharing some portion of the company, which is not something anybody relishes. So it's hard to see where the drivers of growth would be. Particularly, there was a figure earlier this week, a member of the Russian parliament said 70,000 Russians employed in the IT sector have left in the last month. And that's a huge, I mean, okay, Russia's 140 plus million people, but in that sector, that level of brain drain, and, you know, the younger generation just sees, that's been happening also over a period of time. So, you know, the generation that you would like to see stepping up to build a modern, open Russian economy has a lot of good options elsewhere. So unless political conditions improve at home, you know, those people aren't coming back. So that's a telling signal. If I was an investor and said, wait a minute, the smartest people in Russia who would have every comparative advantage over me in understanding this market are reluctant to go back in. Why would I go back in after that? So, and then let alone if Europe decides that they're really going to go green and that Russia is an unreliable supplier of energy, you know, that could really hasten, you know, Russia's decline. So,
Yeah, I see a question here and then we're going to start taking some from a very large audience outside.
So I'm not a political scientist, I'm just an interested citizen.
well, this book is for you. So yes.
So I would make the assumption that Putin has to get out of this with feeling as he won in a way.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true, but let's say this continues to go badly for him. What do you think his response would be? Would he accelerate based on, you know, the way he's behaved in Syria?
Yeah. These are the questions you always have to, you know, it's always the civilians. You always have to, because they ask the hardest questions, you know. The political side, they craft you a way out. This one has no way out. You know, I do think that Putin would respond to pressure within Russia. If things started to become unstable, then I think he might be more interested in cutting a deal. But until that happens, and until you know, Russia shows that it's really costly and not making an advance, and it's really a drag, you know, he'll continue this path in the hope of bleeding Ukraine for, you know, a long time. It's, for me, the most likely scenario is the worst one, where there's an encirclement of the major cities in the eastern half of Ukraine. There is an active insurgency that goes on for a long period of time. And within Russia, it's hard to overthrow an autocrat. And particularly if the war becomes, an insurgency style war where there are casualties, but they're just ongoing, low level, and that could go on for a long time, I'm afraid, because Ukraine looks like they're in no mood to bargain as well. We often think, oh, why don't we just strike a deal with Putin? But if Zelensky said tomorrow, oh, we'll recognize Crimea, we'll recognize the Donbass, and we'll have neutrality, his government would fall. I mean, they said, why do we pay all these lives? For what? Just to be to continue to have our sovereignty undermined. I'm quite pessimistic right now. And I think, what's going to happen on the ground is really going to determine if the Russian advance stalls, the Ukrainians are able to go on the counteroffensive some, that would be a huge blow and a huge shock to demonstrate the incapacity of the Russian military. And, I think that it would be tough to recover, I think, from that.
Tim, I have 3 or 4 questions that sort of, I'll come to you in a second, but fit right in this. One wants to know whether if pushed further, Putin would blackmail the West with nuclear weapons. Another wants to know if there are any red lines that Putin would see that he wouldn't cross in terms of how far he would escalate. Another one wonders if you're surprised by the destruction and disregard for human life that Russia's already displayed. So all kind of goes in the direction. How bad could this get before it was too bad? For the Russians and for Vladimir Putin.
I'm not surprised. So I, with a great deal of uncertainty, my prediction was that the ability of Kiev, Moscow, and Washington to find an agreement was so small that I just didn't see any overlap that those 3 leaders could sell to their populace. So I thought an invasion of some form was likely. I didn't think it would take place so soon. I thought the Kremlin would play for time for much longer to try to convince the West that they were actually interested in a negotiated settlement. The scale of it didn't surprise me. I thought that if they were going to go in, they were going to go in and really try to take Kiev, because the West had made it clear that any incursion was going to be met with a massive response. And if you're going to do the crime, if you're going to do the time, you might as well do the crime. So you might as well really go in. Because I think what Putin would want to do is to seize half of Ukraine, or at least collapse the government, and create such a punitive peace that he could then turn to the West and say, well, let's renegotiate the post-war bargain about security in Europe. And he would be able to do that from a much stronger position if he had a really punitive peace on Ukraine. So at the same time, I think Russian foreign policy elites and the mass public are either in shock or just denial that their country would be able to do this. If you look at the Russian foreign policy elite for months was saying this is all just a bluff, don't worry in the West. Putin will make a deal. He's not crazy. He's not stupid enough to try to occupy half of Ukraine without sufficient number of forces. So it's just not gonna, Andrei Kortunov, lots of people we know, this is what they were telling us. And we're not the kind of country that would invade without a pretext or without, and they're reevaluating their views. And I think a lot of ordinary Russians too, when they see the destruction, either they just deny it and say, oh, that must have been the Ukrainians, this has to be a fake or disinformation, just a psychological self-defense mechanism, or they're kind of really having to reevaluate. I mean, look, if you think about Abu Ghraib, or if you think about, the US invasion of Iraq, a lot of people's eyes were opened by those photos, of what was clearly a war crime. And, we'll see something very similar happening in Russia, and Russians haven't been through this before. So is there a red line? I think Putin respects the NATO membership, that there is a distinction between the Baltics and Ukraine, and between Poland and Ukraine. But I think he must understand that the risks would be a lot higher, and that if they've had this much trouble with the Ukrainian army, throw NATO in there, throw NATO air power into the equation, and that could really turn things on the battlefield, very quickly. So I think Putin's ideal situation is for the war to be rhetorically against the West, but physically against Ukraine, right? That's a very winning, the argument at home that you're fighting Ukraine is a losing one, because Russians don't care that much about Ukraine. But if it's, our fate as a country is at stake because the West wants to dismember and encircle us, there will be, some section of the Russian populace that would respond to that. So, yes, your turn.
Yeah, I got three quick questions.
Okay.
Congratulations on the book. The first question is just following what you just said. You just said Putin's not crazy, he'll accept the deal. So my first question is, how should we evaluate Putin's claim of irredentism, historical injustice you just mentioned, with the prospect of a negotiated peace on our side, right? So is Putin, in other words, is Putin a negotiated person, or is regime change necessary for a sort of a new concept of Europe to incorporate Russia into a new system, right? Second question is directly related to the book. In chapter 6, I think you talk about Russia's economy, which is fascinating. And it got me to thinking about the power of sanctions recently. So do we have any credible information on the money hidden in terms of money and assets, by the Kremlin that can get Putin away from the sanctions? Last question, following Alex's question on China's role here. When we make the assumptions of possible role of China being a broker or something, are we sort of underestimating the personal ties between Xi Jinping and Putin, given the fact that China is turning personalistic as well?
No, I'll take the last one first. I think it was Xi that, did Putin call Xi or Xi call Putin my most intimate friend?
Xi called Putin.
My most intimate. So, they have a very good personal relationship. And Putin used to have good personal relationships with lots of leaders, and he doesn't so much anymore. The Berlusconis and the Schroeders are, retired. But with Xi, he has a good relationship. And, whether or not that makes him a better or a worse broker, like Putin might need someone to sit him down at some point and say, this is not going well. This is not helping you. It's not helping us. You need to adjust. I have no idea whether Xi would play that role. Probably not. I mean, China seems to be, much, they don't like international. Well, I mean, maybe actually, if you think of, look, the international system has done very well for China, and instability could be something that they don't like. So they may, I don't know. I'm just speculating there. On the hidden assets, yes. Some assets are not hidden. The yachts, the real estate. Some assets are hidden and will take a long time to get to. There's no doubt about that. But if oligarchs can't travel, like that is a, Victor Vekselberg, I have a quote in there. He was like, look, I used to travel the world, and now what can I do? And if you're, an international pariah, they have to consider this as well. So the sanctions and sending that signal and naming people, I think is important. And legally, it's very difficult to come within 100 yards of anybody who's on the sanctions list in any way. Any kind of transactions are discouraged by the compliance officer or whatever organization you're in. So, the other point is, it's not as if the oligarchs who are under sanctions, would support this policy even if they weren't under sanctions. They would think, why are we doing this? It doesn't, it's not a policy that, makes a lot of sense. Then on the last question about, so on the irredentis claim, this is in some sense what makes, the Ukraine case so challenging is if, you start allowing borders to be changed according to the, according to historical claims. And the only thing more dangerous than a historian is an amateur historian. And Putin really fancies himself as a historical expert on this. And the important point is that the Ukrainians don't agree with him. And it's really ultimately up to the Ukrainians, right, to decide, what their sovereignty should be. And, the international community should hold that value. That should hold some value for the international community. So the other point is that, within Russia, he in 2014, 2015, he tried to ramp up this Novorossiya notion of, oh, look, historically under Catherine the Great, we had these territories that stretched much further into Eastern Ukraine beyond the Donetsk and Lugansk. And people just went, what are you talking about? Why should I care about this? It just fell flat. So there are a lot of familial ties. Lots of Russians, were born in Ukraine, now live in Russia. Lots of Ukrainians born in Russia now live in Ukraine. And but as that Kenyan diplomat at the United Nations pointed out, look, if you think states have to be ethnically and racially homogeneous, or you go to war, then Africa would be on fire, every waking moment. So, this is really a kind of very traditional sense of sovereignty that I think is not widely held.
Tim, there's a question from Jerry Hudson, who loves your book, by the way.
Yeah, hello, Jerry. How are you?
And he wonders if Putin has so violated the trade-offs that you describe in your book, that he at this point really is close to sacrificing his ability to stay in power. And then there are other questions about whether you think he'll be overthrown, whether you think he'll lose the next election, and so forth. So could you talk a little bit about your view of Putin's longevity in office going forward?
Putin's the trade-off of keeping the elites happy and keeping the mass public happy at the same time just got a lot harder. The economy is hitting both groups. The war, I think, it's very uncertain what the state of public opinion is on the war. I imagine it's very volatile and very sensitive and conditional. There's a lot of conditional support of if things get worse on the battlefield. I think that this really could be a very ugly, damaging war. It's not the first time in Russian history, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, Afghanistan, where failed war efforts led to political change. So it's not inconceivable. I don't think there's a lot of elite support for this move. And the tricky thing, though, is that in personalist autocracies, it's hard to overthrow the autocrat because it's difficult for elites themselves to act collectively, precisely because there are no institutions for them to do so. There's not an opposition party. There's not a strong independent business group that has wealth that's independent from the state. And the mass public as well, I think is going to be very, very split about this. So I think too, I don't rule out the possibility that Putin could be overthrown if things go really bad. I think for the first time in his career, this is the greatest challenge, far more than 2011 when there were protests in Moscow and The Economist had that famous headline, "The beginning of the end of Vladimir Putin." It must have been the very beginning. the beginning of the end. But Putin is on the hook for this. In his address to the Russian people, he said, I have made the decision to begin a special military operation against Ukraine. It wasn't the president of the Russian Federation or the government of the Russian Federation. It was I have done this. So if things go really badly, his position will be badly damaged. There's no doubt about that. And the one thing to keep an eye on is Putin's been popular in absolute terms, but he's also been popular in relative terms, in that there's no other leader who polls nearly as well as Putin. But say Putin's popularity falls, or it's perceived to have fallen, because it's going to be really hard to know, and he becomes just another hardliner sitting around the table. That's a very different scenario than what we see right now. So I think if it's the most likely scenario on the ground where it's an occupation and it lasts for a long time, I think Putin will be able to ride it out. But if the Ukrainians are able to really put up a fight and there's the prospects for domestic instability, Putin will either have to, cut a deal that's much less favorable than when he started, or there could be some movement within Russia to replace him. These guys, they lose power, like Hemingway says, people go bankrupt. First gradually, then suddenly. So, it'll be hard for us to know when it's going to happen. So
One of our guests on the internet wonders if he were overthrown or was replaced, who do you think would replace him? Are there any potential candidates that we can see on the horizon now that would be likely pretenders?
It's dangerous to be the pretender to the throne in Putin's Russia. So people don't advertise this. But at the same time, there's never been a shortage of people who think that they could run a country. So technically, the prime minister would take over, Mishustin, who is a very capable and respected guy, but a political lightweight. He was just put into office in January 2020. He would have to cut some serious deals with, people in the military, the security services, people in some of the big energy companies. But one could imagine a system where they try to broker some agreements among the elite to try to bring a degree of normalcy, back to Russia. I think that would be a winning slogan, peace and a return to normalcy. Whereas Putin is framing this as this apocalyptic, end of the world. If we lose, the West will dismember us. A counter narrative is to say, we want what we had before. Make Russia great again. Make Russia normal again. Would be perhaps a winning kind of slogan.
You mentioned apocalypse. Like we think about the spiritual. Jerry Pankhurst is wondering about Putin's relationship with Russian Orthodoxy. And he wonders whether the religious posture Putin takes is just a sop to elderly and conservatives, or does the power of the Russian Orthodox Church seem important to Putin? And how much is this more than, is there some spiritual quest he's on here?
I have no idea whether he's on a spiritual. We're all on spiritual quests in some way. Putin reads a lot of books, right? And figuring out which ones are important to him is very difficult. If you look at Putin's writings and comments about that branch of Russian philosophy and thought about Russian Russian state, nationalism, and orthodoxy as the pillars of the Russian state, and the notion that there's this great Eurasian peoples that Russia is destined to lead against a decadent West. Whether he actually believes any of this stuff, I don't know. The skeptic in me says probably not. It's not usually the case that 60-year-old men suddenly have a change in their worldview. Putin has long been really cynical long been skeptical of the West and its motives. It's a valuable tool for some corners of the Russian population, but Russia is a very secular country. It's a very urban, secular, modern society. So, I mean, certainly religion plays a much bigger role in US politics than it does in Russian politics. You know, witness the Supreme Court hearings where, you know, you're asked how, you know, rate your faith, how faithful you are on a scale of 1 to 10. That wouldn't happen in Russia. But for Putin to be seen with the patriarch and the oligarchs to be leaned on to build, you know, churches in Russia as part of the broader, you know, way to try to distinguish Russia from the West. Yeah, I think that's part of the story, but I don't think that Russian Orthodox Church is an independent actor in any way. It has any influence, but as a symbol, you know, with some sectors of society, I think it is important.
I've got a couple of questions that sort of have an academic flavor, and they wonder whether we should take polls done in Russia seriously. And so one question is framed, you know,
Yeah.
given the political
Yeah.
coercion and dangers,
Yeah.
can we trust responses? And another wonders whether, given the political climate,
Yeah.
are people's responses. And in your book, you
Yeah.
spend quite a bit of time on
Yeah.
polls. So maybe you could talk about
Yeah.
how we should interpret the polling results we have
Yeah.
from before this war,
Yeah.
and when you think
Yeah.
we can use them again.
No, I think the you know, public opinion polling in every country is hard. We all know that. In Russia, it's possible, and it's been incredibly valuable tool for understanding Russian society. It's gotten us so far beyond a lot of the lazy tropes about Russia by demonstrating things like, you know, most Russians think that Ukraine should be its own state, whereas without that public opinion polling, the easy narrative would have been, oh, long historical ties, common language, you know, or similar language. And we're able to, on a number of lots of different kinds of questions, able to, you know, really understand Russian society much better than we did, you know, 30 years ago. There are always questions about Ramzan Kadyrov, like I would not, who is a very threatening, a governor of the Chechnya, who is a very powerful individual. I would not trust answers on that question. I think people would really be afraid. Whereas Putin, I think people, until probably 2 or 3 years ago, were willing to answer honestly those questions. Now I'm a lot more skeptical. Even leading up to the war, this is a technical answer, but it's an interesting one. For a long time, the approval question on Putin and the name 5 political figures that you trust questions tracked for a long period of time. Up around 2018, the approval question flattened out, and name 5 politicians that you trust went from around Putin being included on those lists about 60% of the time to about 30% of the time. So it's much easier to answer a question where you're, you know, just saying yes or no to an approval question. But if you can hide behind, oh yes, 5 politicians, let me answer that. You know, here are the 5, and then you don't include Putin. You know, we have seen a big change in that in the last 2 or 3 years. We've also done some public opinion work on this question, and we're not able to replicate it. All that we can say at this point is we're not able to replicate the very clean results we got in 2015. There's something going on that, you know, even a year ago, when you ask the Putin approval question, something's going on. We haven't quite figured out what it is. Now I would be incredibly skeptical of any polling done in Russia. You know, these are mostly done by, they're mostly face-to-face. There is a 15-year sentence for calling the war a war. So rather than a special military operation, so you can't even ask the question properly. And it's really, you know, Russian society is going to become a lot less legible for us as academics, but it's also going to become a lot less legible for the Kremlin. The Kremlin was by far the biggest consumer of polls in Russia. They just flooded the market. They contracted with everybody too, even with the independent polls, because they needed to keep their kind of house polls honest. And now, I think that's also, opinions are going to be much more volatile, I think. So even if people are answering honestly, they're going to be very sensitive to question framing, and their opinions might change as new information comes about. So unfortunately for us academics, I think it's going to be really difficult to do surveys in Russia for some time.
Another question.
Russian society is as diverse as any other society. And we need to recognize that there are people who support Putin. There are a lot of people who don't support Putin. And there are a lot of people who just kind of shrug their shoulders about Putin. So the Kremlin spends an enormous amount of effort and time and resources to convince people that Putin is indispensable for Russia. But I think history shows nobody's indispensable. And that there are lots of people who could run Russia and do a very good job.
I think we've had some technical change here, but we'll
It's okay.
just continue on.
Oh, we get subtitles here too.
There are a number of questions, I'm going to have to do them from my memory now, about how this might be negotiated to a solution. One stuck, Chuck Herman, who you as a director at Mershon, maybe you were here overlapped, I don't remember, wonders whether Xi Jinping could be a mediator. You've seen the Prime Minister of Israel there. Do you see anyone who Putin would trust that's also trusted in the West who could help mediate if we get to this place where there's some kind of discussion going on?
Yeah, I mean, she is certainly an interesting person if you had to have a come to Jesus talk with Putin. I think people like Schroeder and Berlusconi, who at one point might have been able to play that role, maybe, have been discredited sufficiently. Angela Merkel would be somebody as well, who I would think about as somebody who would certainly have the credibility in the West, and has a relationship with Putin, speaks German with him. So that's a possibility. But I think the problem is less the identity of the interlocutor than just the fluidity of the situation on the ground. I mean, until there's really a military stalemate, both sides are going to be unwilling, I think, to give up what they see as potential gains. So if the Russians think, eventually we're going to wear them down, then why make an agreement now when 6 months from now we'll just be able to completely demilitarize Ukraine. Whereas the Ukrainians might be thinking, how long can the Russians keep this up? We can keep attacking their sidelines. We're a big country. Ukraine stretches from New York City to Chicago to Toronto down to North Carolina. Occupy this, right? You want to come? How many troops do you want to bring? And how many do you want us to send back? So, we're only a month into this. And as horrific as this has been, I mean, Kherson, Mariupol, a city of 400,000 people has just been obliterated. I mean, just flattened. There's still a lot of game left to be played here. And some people have mentioned that Russia will need to be resupplied, or at least might want to pause in the next 2 weeks or so, if only because they're going to need to resupply their troops, because it's hard to keep them in the field over such a long area for a long period of time, especially when your original plan was just to seize the capital. So some people have mentioned that there might be a window where there might be a moment where some more serious negotiations could take place that are taking place now, which seem to be really doomed to failure as long as there's so much fighting going on. So.
Yeah, we have Vlad Chuba who's asking whether you see any kind of space for a negotiation to succeed, or are you mentioned before you didn't see any overlapping positions before the war began. I personally, I don't see any still yet.
Yeah.
Do you see any likely to emerge?
I don't see them yet. But the point I've made, but I think is still important and hasn't been appreciated as much as, what happens in Russia is going to matter a lot too, not just what happens in Ukraine. And Ukraine, it's, to seal off the eastern part of Ukraine from weapons coming in from the West, that's going to be a challenge. So this could go on, for a while.
Marcus?
Just to take a step back to John's question. In the debate, we've talked a lot about the next 2 weeks, negotiations. I'm kind of a political economy guy, and I'm thinking, you evaluated the Russian economy's prospects as dim, and that struck me as hopelessly optimistic. In the sense that here's an economy that's more corrupt and substantially smaller than Italy's. It's subject to more draconian sanctions that pretty much anybody's been subject to for a very long time. The banks can't operate internationally. The foreign affairs are gone, or big chunks of them. How is there not a financial collapse? How is there not an economic collapse brought on by this? How is there anything that doesn't make the Great Depression look okay, looming on the 6-month horizon? You can have capital control today, but
so the question is about prospects for economic collapse in Russia. I think this is what the Ukrainians are hoping for, that the sanctions, which have already had a fairly sizable impact. We have the $600 billion in reserves, 400 billion of it was in dollars, which are now toxic. They still have the gold and the yuan and reserves, but it's a much smaller piece of the pie. You already have the largest tank making factory in Russia shutting down. You might have thought they would have stockpiled some of these foreign components beforehand, but apparently not. Sheremetyevo, the biggest international airport, laid off 40% of its workers. One question is just, can they withstand the shock? If oil and gas revenues still continue to provide, $500–700 million a day in revenue, and if that were to be cut off, that you could really have a seizing up of the Russian economy in short order, I would think. But that would mean high gas prices, high energy prices in Europe. These are democracies. Politicians are more worried about the votes in Dresden than they are in Tomsk. So, whether or not they would be able to do that is, is not likely. But it really, I mean, I agree with you that the risks of political instability emanating from the economic crisis are very real. So.
I have a question from a viewer who has friends in Russia. And she says that in recent communications now, their view, that what they say over the telephone is that Ukrainians are all lying, that it's all fake news. And she's wondering whether the Russian telephones and the like are being monitored. Should she believe that her Russian friends actually think this? Or should she believe her Russian friends are afraid to speak even over the telephone with people in the United States?
Maybe both. It's a good question. We know from psychology that presenting people with basic facts is often an unpersuasive way to change their mind. People have incredibly sophisticated defense mechanisms not to believe things that they don't want to believe. And nobody wants to believe that their government is committing war crimes. And that's a very difficult bridge to cross. So people look for other explanations for reasons we well understand. I would suggest WhatsApp rather than the phone or Zoom conversations. I know some of my Russian colleagues have been wary of that, of email. Certainly both things are going on. And there's a broader question about the role of the Russian public, and my Ukrainian friends, of which I have a few, more than a few, have been challenging my Russian friends. And I'm in a number of groups where there's overlap between Russian scholars and Ukrainian scholars. We all work on a similar region, and there have been very heated conversations about why isn't the Russian public doing more? We're, given the war crimes being committed in Ukraine. And Russian colleagues, point to the sociologist Gregory Yudin, a really good sociologist, protested on February 25th, the first day of the war, had his skull cracked open and was arrested. So that's also a severe deterrent to taking part in protest in Russia. So it's, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is for how we, as academics, negotiate with our Russian colleagues in going forward when, some have vocally opposed the war and left. Some have kind of not vocally opposed the war and continue on. And, I also, not people I'm friendly with, but people who I've been in rooms with have been vocal supporters of the war as well. And, war is not a time for drawing fine distinctions like this. And, one concern is that there's just a broad brush of, everyone in Russia must be supporting the war. Look at these polls. Why aren't they on the street? When I think it's a much more nuanced situation.
We have time for just one last topic, and it's a short one. But you end your book with a chapter, if I remember correctly, it's called The Death of Expertise.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you just say a little bit about what you think we as scholars should be doing, not just about the war, but as we go forward in studying Russia. And is the death of expertise on this question a big problem in the United States? We're not. What do you just generally address that topic, because it's not something that's come up.
The reason I wrote the book is because I was frustrated with the general tenor of the discussion on Russia, which I thought had become incredibly simplistic and, reducing the politics of a country that spans 11 time zones with a rich intellectual and cultural tradition to the worldview of a single individual or to kind of lazy historical tropes was problematic, to say the least. Also, that there was this tremendous research on Russia being done that I wanted to publicize and advertise. some of these are my former students. I want, I want to advertise their work as well. And, in some sense, the book has worked. I mean, it's gotten me entree into a part of Russia watching that I had been very much removed from, the kind of policy, not, one step removed from the policy making world, part of the broader conversation. So one thing I do in the book is I make a comparative move to say the domestic politics in Russia are like domestic politics in lots of autocracies. And I did that because I think that's right. I think it's a useful way to look at Russia, but it's also a useful way to turn down the temperature on debates that have just been incredibly heated. And I also am old enough to remember, Stephen Cohen versus Richard Pipes, and the incredible politicization of Soviet studies. And I don't want to go back to that either, which I very much worry is a future where some views are just defined, some groups define some views as just as non-negotiable. So I think academic research on Russia is going to be a lot harder, but I think it's needed now more than ever because emotions have only gotten hotter since the start of the invasion. And I'm pretty confident that scholars are going to be able to continue to study Russia in a way that's acceptable to the academic community, which is an important barrier to clear, but also be able to continue to say important things about Russia. I mean, the big data revolution, lots of smart Russians, we're still going to be engaging with Russia, and it's going to be a lot more difficult. But I think the wrong thing to do would be then to revert to the Sovietological practices of, well, Putin was reading this, so this tells us, he must be going to do X. Or so academic research is going to be a lot harder, but I still think we can do it, and it's going to be even more important.
I want to thank you, Tim, for a terrific talk and a terrific book. For those of you, I've seen a couple people in the chat asking for the name again. It's called Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. It's a terrific book. It's endorsed by all the players who matter. In fact, Michael McFall says it's a dereliction of duty if we don't teach it in our classes. I agree, it's a terrific book. So thank you so much, Tim. I want to mention to all of those who are listening outside that on April 8th, I'll be hosting a conference also for Mershon on US and NATO and their relationship with Russia. We have a terrific lineup of scholars from the United States, a few from Russia, and a number of Europeans from France, Germany, and elsewhere. So you can go to the Mershon Center.osu.edu and look at the lineup and the timing for the panels on April 8th. And without further ado, I want to thank you, Tim, again one last time, and thank you all for tuning in. I hope to see some of you on April 8th.